Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this lecture is titled Fighting Against Fascism in Europe and for Equality in the United States. The main idea we are hoping to convey or communicate is stated in this thesis statement. As World War II began, Black Americans found themselves fighting against fascism in Europe and for social justice and equality in the United States. War's beginnings. Hitler arises in Germany. As the world economy wallowed in the Great Depression, the international order collapsed in Europe and Asia. Germany, under the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, and Italy, under the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, created an alliance known as the Axis, aimed at taking control of Europe. And in this photograph, you can see Hitler, right arm in Nazi salute. Hitler and Mussolini formed the Axis powers. Adolf Hitler of Germany, left in the photo, and Benito Mussolini of Italy on the right, were fascist dictators who advocated a program based on extreme nationalism that brutally suppressed all internal opposition and used violence to gain their will abroad. Germany was the dominant power in the Axis. Hitler's Nazi or National Socialist Party in part blamed communists and foreign powers for the nation's economic depression and loss of power. But more than anti-communism, Hitler was driven by a virulent form of racism. Unlike racists in the United States, he focused his hatred almost exclusively on Jewish people, blaming them for all of Germany's social and economic problems. He was also anti-Black, but he was predominantly anti-Jewish. Hitler made no secret of the fact that he hated Jewish people and blamed them for Germany's problems. On the left, you see a book, a dust jacket to Hitler's autobiography called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which was published in 1925. This book was Hitler's manifesto against Jewish people around the world, and especially in Germany. Using evil language, Hitler tried to demonize Jewish people. This is a quote. With satanic joy in his face, the black-haired Jewish youth lurks in wait for the unsuspecting girl whom he defiles with his blood, thus stealing her from her people. With every means, he tries to destroy the racial foundations of the people he has set out to subjugate. So he's stating that Jewish people have pure blood, and that Jewish people, by intermarrying with them, are somehow defiling Jewish blood and making people less German. It's really a very hate-filled kind of rhetoric. But when people believe certain things, it causes them to do certain things. Ideas lead to action. In that connection, we take a look at Kristallnacht, 1938. In his writing and spoken words, Hitler's ideas about Jewish people led to horrific actions against them. The German word Kristallnacht means crystal night or the night of broken glass. In this photograph, on November the 9th, 1938, Nazi Germany launched an attack on Jews, destroying their businesses and burning their synagogues. This street scene in Berlin, Germany, shows the shattered windows of Jewish businesses, Jewish-owned businesses. Nazi propaganda leader Joseph Goebbels recorded the event known as Kristallnacht in his diary with these shocking words from one of the most senior, high-ranking officials of the German government at that time. Yesterday, Berlin, referring to the attacks on Jewish-owned businesses. Yesterday, Berlin, there, all proceeded fantastically. One fire after another. It is good that way. 100 dead, but no German property damaged. Goebbels falsely was saying that Jewish people were not and never could be part of Germany. And in the circle on the left, in the photograph inside the red circle, you can see people who, for some reason, seem to be laughing about what has taken place. The Holocaust in Europe during World War II, 1939 to 1945. The Holocaust was the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi or German regime and its allies and collaborators. Holocaust is a word of Greek origin meaning sacrifice by fire. The Nazis who came to power in Germany in January 1933 believed that Germans were racially superior to other groups and that Jewish persons deemed or so-called inferior were an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial and biological inferiority. Roma persons or gypsies, people with disabilities, some of the Slavic peoples, Polish persons, Russians, and others, Soviet prisoners of war, and Black people. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, among them communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and gay people. This map shows the extermination camps highlighted in red inside occupied Poland. Most major concentration camps, labor camps, prison camps, major deportation routes, and major massacre sites. Eyeglasses of Holocaust victims. Eyeglasses, clothing, footwear, and other personal effects were taken from the prisoners before they were taken to the gas chamber. And these were found after the Allied or US and Russian-led forces liberated the death camps. And these eyeglasses were piled up in 6 warehouses at the camp. In 1933, that's Auschwitz, by the way, the particular camp that we're discussing, Auschwitz. In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe stood at over 9 million people. Most European Jews lived in countries that Nazi Germany would occupy or influence during World War II. By the end of the war in 1945, the Germans and their allies and collaborators killed nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews as part of the so-called final solution. Hitler and Mussolini provoke World War II. Throughout the late 1930s, the Germans and the Italians embarked on a series of military campaigns that placed much of Central Europe under their power. In August 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact or treaty with the Soviet Union, a prelude to a September 1st attack on Poland by both nations. A few days later, Britain and France reacted to the invasion by declaring war on the Axis powers, thus beginning World War II. And you can see those arrows, shows you how much military aggression occurred under the Nazi powers. Japan's imperial ambitions. As Germany and Italy pursued their plans in Europe during the 1930s, the Japanese Empire attempted to gain control of Asia. Excuse me. Through most of the decade, Japan extended its dominion over China, and by the end of the 1930s, was prepared to push European and American forces out of the Pacific region. This threat led to a rising tide of conflict with the United States, which at that time, as we have seen in earlier lectures about US imperialism, the United States held, among other islands, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, along with other islands in the Pacific. And of course, the United States had extensive trade relations in Asia. Many American leaders also were concerned about the security of their nation's west coast should the Japanese achieve their goal. You can see on this map in the green, inside the green circle, you can see Japan. But then you can see in the red the extent of Japanese domination and the Japanese empire as of 1942. China, Thailand, what is today Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, and so on. The United States enters the war in December 1941. This is a photograph of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from a Japanese point of view. This photograph was taken from inside a Japanese bomber, an airplane with bombs, during the torpedo attack on ships that were moored or positioned on both sides of Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. The view looks about east with the supply depot, the submarine base, and a fuel tank farm in the right center distance. And I know it's a little hard to pinpoint those. In this photograph, a torpedo has just hit. You can see the water shooting up. A torpedo has just hit the USS West Virginia on the far side of Ford Island in the center of your photograph. And then there are other battleships moored nearby, the USS Nevada, USS Arizona, and so on. You can see inside, and of course there are a lot of other warships or battleships that are moored or stationed there, or parked, as you would say, if it were a car. In the red circle, there are two red circles. Inside those red circles are Japanese bombers. One of them in the right, right over the island, and another one on the right over the Navy Yard. And of course, this photograph was taken from the inside of a third airplane. Excuse me. But this shows Pearl Harbor the attack on Pearl Harbor from a Japanese point of view. This is Pearl Harbor from a United States point of view. On December the 7th, 1941, Japanese bombers unleashed a 90-minute attack against U.S. ships, planes, and personnel at the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Successive waves of Japanese bomber attacks killed more than 2,400 Americans and injured more than 1,100. In the photograph at the left, the USS Arizona was destroyed and it sunk to the bottom of the harbor. Over 1,100 Americans died aboard the USS Arizona just in that one attack and that one ship. Several quarts of oil reportedly still leak from the destroyed battleship nearly 80 years after the Japanese attack. The December 7th, 1941 attack at Pearl Harbor led the United States to declare war on Japan the next day, December 8th, 1941. In response to the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor the day before, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, on December the 8th, 1941, asked the United States Congress for a war declaration against Japan. When the United States declared war on Japan, Germany, an ally of Japan, then declared war on the United States. Suddenly, the United States was at war on two fronts, or two parts of the globe, one in the Pacific against Japan, and another front in Europe against Germany and the Axis powers. And you can see in that headline, it says hostile planes sighted at San Francisco. Black Americans respond to world events. Many Americans, especially African Americans, responded to the emerging world crisis with growing activism. When Ethiopia was invaded in 1935 by the army of Italian fascist Benito Mussolini, it was one of only two truly independent Black-ruled nations in the world. And Black communities throughout the United States organized to send aid to Ethiopia. And you can see in the red circle at the bottom, the red oval at the bottom, you can see the Axis powers head to Ethiopia for war in May 1935. Mass meetings in support of the embattled Ethiopians were held in New York and other large cities inside the United States, while reporters from Black newspapers such as J.A. Rogers of the Pittsburgh Courier brought the horror of this war home to their readers. Although the mechanized Italian army won the war rather quickly, the conflict alerted many African Americans and others to the dangers of fascism and reawakened in many Americans an interest in the fate of Africa. Excuse me. You can see on these signs a newspaper from Brooklyn, Italians and Ethiopians clash in first battle. And then on the right, you can see a protest in New York asking Americans to support Ethiopia under attack from fascist Italians. Helping Spain. In 1936, the Spanish Republic, which was left-leaning, it was a popularly elected government, but it leaned left. It was moderately socialist, excuse me, in nature. The left-leaning Spanish Republic became embroiled in a civil war against a fascist movement led by General Francisco Franco and supported by Germany and Italy. That is, Franco tried to topple, with Hitler and Mussolini's help, a popularly elected government. Many leftist American men and women, including a group of about 100 African Americans, traveled to Spain in 1936 and 1937 to serve with the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, or the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, an integrated fighting force of about 3,000 American volunteers, trying to prevent Spain from becoming a fascist state through a coup d'etat or an overthrow. Among the 100 African Americans in Spain were two women, Salaria Key on the left in this picture with the yellow arrow, who fought on the battlefield, and a woman from Chicago named Thyra Edwards, who participated in the Medical Bureau and the North American Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy. Support for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade or Battalion reflected a commitment to the communist vision of internationalism found among a small sector of African Americans and others. But the mobilization for full-scale war, however, would soon bring the vast majority of Black people and their organizations into the fight against fascism abroad and for equality and justice in the United States. A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington. Between 1935 and 1940, the American government, along with the governments of France and Britain, spent so much on arms or weapons that the United States economy finally was lifted out of the Depression. Or to say it another way, the Great Depression ended in the United States not because of the New Deal programs, though those programs stabilized the economy, but what lifted the United States out of joblessness to full employment was war. But as the United States mobilized its economy for war and rebuilt its military, it did so in keeping with past practices of discrimination and exclusion. As unemployed white workers streamed into aircraft factories, shipyards, and other centers of war production, jobless African Americans usually found themselves left waiting at the gate. Many all-white AFL unions, as we talked about before, sometimes they were referred to as Jim Crow unions or Jim Crow locals. Many all-white AFL unions enforced closed shop agreements that prevented their employers from hiring Black workers who were not part of the labor organization. So the locals would not admit Black members, and therefore they could not get union jobs. Government-funded training programs regularly rejected Black applicants, often reasoning that training them would be pointless given their poor prospects of finding skilled work. The United States Employment Service, the USES, actually filled white-only requests from defense workers or for defense workers. The military itself, the United States Armed Forces, made it clear that although it would accept Black men in their proportion to the population, about 11% at that time, it would put Black service people in segregated units and assign them to service duties, menial tasks. The US Navy limited Black servicemen or sailors to menial positions, while the Marine Corps and the Army Air Corps refused to accept them altogether. In this tremendous photograph at the left, we see the 41st Engineer Battalion, a segregated U.S. Army unit which served with distinction in World War II, but its members experienced discrimination upon their return to the United States after the war ended. The Double V campaign. When the Pittsburgh Courier, of African-American newspaper, published a letter, which you can see on the left, from a reader named James G. Thompson, whose letter was published on January the 31st, 1942. That letter from Mr. Thompson asked a very important question about African-American military service and post-military life. He asked this question: would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? And then he brilliantly suggested a double V or double victory campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Embodying the spirit of the Double V campaign, African-American protest groups and newspapers criticized discrimination in the defense program. 2 months before the 1940 presidential election, the NAACP, the Urban League, and other groups pressed President Roosevelt to take action, but he responded with little of substance. As a result, during late 1940, the NAACP and other groups staged mass protest rallies around the country. But once the election was safely won, President Roosevelt, anxious not to offend white Southern politicians he needed to back his war program, no longer agreed or now refused even to meet with Black leaders. You can see in the picture in the center a group of African Americans who are participating in the Double V program. You can see a piece of paper in the middle. This is a Double V home. And then on the lower left, inside the red circle, that tremendous logo, double victory. Victory at democracy at home and democracy abroad. Randolph's plan, the March on Washington movement. In January 1941, A. Philip Randolph, who, as we know and have seen, was president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and who had been working with other groups to get the attention of Roosevelt, called on Black Americans to unify their protests and direct them at the national government somehow. He suggested that 10,000 Black Americans march on Washington, D.C. under the slogan, "We loyal Negro American citizens demand the right to work and vote." We demand the right to work and fight for our country. In the coming months, Randolph helped to create the March on Washington movement, which soon became the largest mass movement of Black Americans since the activities of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association of the 1920s. Among the demands that the March on Washington movement made were a presidential order forbidding companies with government contracts from engaging in racial discrimination, the elimination of race-based exclusion from defense training courses, and a requirement that the U.S. Employment Service supply workers on a non-racial basis. Randolph also wanted an order to abolish segregation in the United States Armed Forces. It's important to know that Randolph departed from the leadership tactics of most other African-American protest groups of the time because he prohibited white participation and specifically encouraged the participation of members of the Black working class. Randolph's powerful appeal captured the support of many African Americans who had not before taken part in the activities of middle-class dominated groups like the NAACP. On the left, you can see a letter from A. Philip Randolph to Walter White, the secretary of the NAACP. And you can see here how he is encouraging Black Americans to mobilize and aim their protest at the United States government. FDR's response. Soon, A. Philip Randolph alarmed the president by raising the number expected to march from 10,000 to 50,000. FDR, the president, fearing that Black protest of such a public nature would undermine America's democratic rhetoric and provide ammunition for the German propaganda machine, the president dispatched or asked his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, to try to persuade A. Philip Randolph not to march. But their pleas for patience fell on Randolph's deaf ears, forcing Roosevelt and his top military leaders to meet with Randolph and other Blacks. FDR in that meeting offered a set of superficial changes, but the African Americans stood resolute and firm in their demands and raised the stakes by increasing their estimate of the number of Black marchers coming to Washington to 100,000. By the end of June 1941, the president gave in. He capitulated, and he had his aides draft Executive Order 8802, which convinced Randolph to call off the march. It was a grand moment. To this day, Roy Wilkins, a great leader of the NAACP, wrote in his autobiography years later, to this day, I don't know if he would have been able to turn out enough marchers to make his point stick, but what a bluff it was. A tall, courtly Black man with Shakespearean diction and the stare of an eagle had looked the patrician Roosevelt in the eye and made him back down. And on the left, you can see a poster called "Why Should We March?" to promote the March on Washington. And you can see the number of marchers growing. At the time, the president had asked he said Americans should be free from want or need and free from fear. And A. Philip Randolph said, Black people should be free from want. Black people should be free from fear, and Black people should be free from Jim Crow. Executive Order 8802. On the left is a copy from the National Archives of part of Executive Order 8802. On the surface, at least, the president's order, this Executive Order 8802, was a significant change in the government's stance or position. You can see there on the left, the president said, I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. and I do hereby declare that it is the duty of employers and of labor organizations in furtherance of said policy and of this order to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And that was a very important policy statement. But the order did not say anything about desegregation of the military, although the president privately gave assurances that he would begin to lower some of the key barriers to military service. As one eminent historian has said, Executive Order 8802, although it was the first presidential action countering discrimination since Reconstruction, it was no new Emancipation Proclamation. Black excitement with the order soon turned sour as many industries, especially in the South, found ways to evade its clear intent and engaged in only token or minimal hirings. What the Black community learned in this instance and would witness repeatedly in the decades to come was that the mere statement of anti-discrimination principles and the establishment of commissions and committees did not lead to the eradication of inequalities. And the order said nothing about union discrimination. Nonetheless, the threat of the march, the issuance of the executive order, and creation of the Fair Employment Practices Commission marked, on the part of the government, at least the formal acknowledgement, the formal admission that the government bore some responsibility to protect Black and minority rights in employment. But Black activists and their allies would have to continue to fight if the order was to have any meaning in the long run. Randolph tried to lead the effort, but would find it difficult to do so because of the opposition of key government agencies, notably among them the military, and because of the political power of Southern congressmen, and a belief among white people that racial issues could wait for attention until after the war was over. I included this photograph of a very important person. This is Howard P. Perry, U.S. Marine Corps. Howard Perry was the first African American to report to Montford Point, North Carolina Marine Training Camp after Executive Order 8802 lowered the barriers or opened the doors to Black Americans. Howard P. Perry. Civil rights after World War II, with the civil rights movement after World War II. President Harry S. Truman, you can see him speaking at the podium in the photograph at the far left, and the red arrow points to President Truman. And seated in the chairs there, to the president, in the front row on the right is Walter White, the president of the NAACP, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of, or by this point, the widow of Franklin Roosevelt, who had passed away. And President Truman became the president when Roosevelt died. President Harry S. Truman, through executive orders, began to attack discrimination and segregation in federal employment. A. Philip Randolph pushed Truman to end segregation in the armed forces. During World War II, the Navy had begun the process of desegregation, although the Army remained segregated well into the Korean conflict. But in a special message to Congress on February the 2nd, 1948, President Truman proposed a bill that would make lynching a federal crime. And he made these words, or uttered these words in his speech. A specific federal measure is needed to deal with the crime of lynching, against which I cannot speak too strongly. It is a principle of our democracy, written into our Constitution, that every person accused of an offense against the law shall have a fair, orderly trial in an impartial court. We have made great progress toward this end, but I regret to say that lynching has not yet finally disappeared from our land. So long as one person walks in fear of lynching, we shall not have achieved equal justice under the law. I call upon the Congress to take decisive action against this crime. But the anti-lynching bill was rejected by the Congress. Nonetheless, despite his many legislative defeats, Harry S. Truman was the first president in the 20th century to actively support civil rights legislation. And by the time of the Eisenhower administration in the early 1950s, civil rights campaigns were beginning to take on a momentum of their own. And the NAACP continued to protest discrimination in a variety of court cases. President Truman also was the first president to speak before the NAACP, as you can see on the left. Brown versus Board of Education. Parents of Linda Brown on the left. On the left is a photograph of young Linda Brown, a student in Topeka, Kansas. Her parents, supported by the NAACP, sued in court the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education to admit their daughter to an all-white school that was closer to their home than the black school she was forced to attend much farther away. On May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court came to the unanimous 9-0 decision that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This, of course, was a reversal of an earlier Supreme Court doctrine established in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in the late 19th century. Because of this decision, Brown versus Board, and a companion decision, sometimes called Brown 2, 1 year later, school boards across the country were urged to desegregate their schools with all deliberate speed. This wording, with all deliberate speed, actually allowed many districts to drag out the process of desegregation for years, although this was not the intent of the court. President Eisenhower disagreed with the decision, but knew that the president would have to carry out what the Supreme Court said was now the law of the land. The president immediately desegregated Washington, D.C. schools, veterans hospitals, and Navy yards. Brown versus Board is historically important because it outlawed the judicial doctrine of separate but equal, and it desegregated public education. And you can see on the right the document from the Supreme Court the following year, sometimes called Brown 2. And then the red rectangle at the bottom says the opinions of this court as are necessary and proper to admit to public schools on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed the parties to this case. The tragedy of Emmett Till. The violent reaction of white Southerners to the growing assertiveness of African Americans found expression in the summer of 1955 in the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till of Chicago, an event that helped galvanize the emerging civil rights movement. Emmett Till, in this photograph on the left with his mother, Mamie, Emmett Till was visiting relatives in the small town of Money, Mississippi. He had come down from Chicago to visit relatives and to work. On a dare from his friends, Emmett Till entered Bryant's grocery store and allegedly whistled at Carolyn Bryant, the wife of the owner, as he was leaving the store. Till was unaware, even though his mother had schooled him on the ways of the South. Emmett was unaware how far white people in the town would go to avenge what they perceived as a breach of white supremacy's racial etiquette. On the left is a picture of Bryant's grocery store, where Emmett Till entered to buy some candy and some soda pop. On the right is a sign from the Mississippi Freedom Trail in front of that store, or what remains of that store. 14-year-old Emmett Till came to this site to buy candy in August 1955. White shopkeeper Carolyn Bryant accused the black youth of flirting with her, and shortly thereafter, Till was abducted by Bryant's husband and his half-brother. Till's tortured body was later found in the Tallahatchie River. The two men were tried and acquitted. But later sold their murder confession to Look magazine. Till's death received international attention and is widely credited with sparking the American civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Emmett Till's killers and accuser. Emmett Till's killers were J.W. Milam on the far left and Roy Bryant on the far right, sitting with their wives. And the accuser, excuse me, Carolyn Bryant, is second from the right in the photograph. This photograph was taken in September 1955 during their murder trial. An all-white jury found the killers not guilty in less than 1 hour. The pain and courage of Mamie Till, Emmett's mother. The murder of Emmett Till shaped the consciousness, in the words of one, of an entire generation of young African-American activists. Partly this was due to the efforts of Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, who you can see in the photograph with a family member. Unwilling to let Americans turn away from this injustice, Till's mother had her son's mangled body displayed in an open casket in Chicago. And that photographs from that funeral were published in Jet magazine and became known or visible to people around the world. She wanted people to see what had happened. At the funeral of Emmett Till in Chicago, thousands of mourners filed by on the left, the photograph at the left, to pay their respects, and many people committed themselves right then and there to fighting the system that made this crime possible. Mamie Till Bradley also traveled around the nation, speaking to groups on whom her grief had a profound effect. Her pain united a nation. Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, are buried close to each other in Burr Oak Cemetery, southwest of Chicago. The inscription on Mamie's grave reads as follows: Her pain united a nation. Her son's tragic death, the inscription continues, became the impetus, the spark for the civil rights movement of the mid-50s or the mid-1950s. Boycotting buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Inspired by Emmett Till, Black leaders across the South and in Montgomery, Alabama, including Rosa Parks, made a decision to boycott buses there. The civil rights movement gained additional momentum with a challenge to segregation in public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. In December 1955, having been convinced by local civil rights leaders, Rosa Parks, in the photograph on the left, refused to move to the back of a city bus. She was arrested, which prompted over 50 Black leaders to meet in a Montgomery church to discuss their response. They agreed on a brilliant plan to boycott the city bus system, which was an especially effective tactic since Blacks made up 60 to 70% of total ridership. Eventually, the bus boycott succeeded in desegregating city transportation. But the real gain of the conference was the emergence of a new, fresh, dynamic leadership exemplified by Martin Luther King Jr., a 27-year-old minister at the time. King was chosen to be the spokesperson for the protest and to lead the boycott. Years later, Rosa Parks was asked why she refused to move to the back of the bus. She replied, "I thought of Emmett Till and I couldn't go back." And here on the right, the upper right, you can see the police report, and in the red, inside the red rectangle are the words, "We received a call upon arrival. The bus operator said he had a colored female sitting in the white section of the bus and would not move back." Martin Luther King. "The most decisive speech of my life," King said. In this set of photographs taken at the very same time, we see Martin Luther King Jr. giving a speech at Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama on December the 5th, 1955. And I wanted to read to you, excuse me, a portion of his speech toward the end. And you can see his speech held the attention of his audience. In part, Dr. King said this: "We, the disinherited of this land, we who have been oppressed so long, are tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. May I say to you, my friends, as I come to a close, that we must keep God in the forefront. Let us be Christian in all of our actions. But I want to tell you this evening that it is not enough for us to talk about love. Love is one of the pivotal points of the Christian faith. There is another side called justice. Standing beside love is always justice. And we are only using the tools of justice. Not only are we using the tools of persuasion But we've come to see that we've got to use the tools of coercion, legal force. Not only is this thing a process of education, it is also a process, but it is also a process of legislation. As we stand and sit here this evening, and as we prepare ourselves for what lies ahead, let us go out with a grim and bold determination that we are going to stick together. We are going to work together. Right here in Montgomery, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, of black people, fleecy locks and black complexion, a people who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights, and thereby they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and of civilization. That speech, Dr. King referred to as the most decisive speech of his life. And he gave a lot of important speeches. Martin Luther King Jr. brought a new tactic to the civil rights movement: nonviolent resistance. This method of peaceful protest combined certain teachings of Jesus Christ with those of Gandhi. And you can see Gandhi's picture in Dr. King's office. King described it. He described nonviolent resistance as a philosophy deeply embedded in our religious tradition. Southern opposition to civil rights. In 1956, in reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, over 100 members of the United States Congress from the former Confederate states signed what they called a Southern Manifesto, pledging to fight the Supreme Court's decision at every turn. This Southern resistance to integration was put to the test in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Central High School was supposed to admit 9 African-American students in September that year. But Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus placed the Arkansas National Guard around the school to defy the segregation order. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock to put the Arkansas National Guard under federal control. The Little Rock Nine, as the students came to be called, entered the school, as you can see in this photograph on the left. The Little Rock Nine entered the school, but were met with such protests and threats of violence that they had to be removed. Then school officials in Little Rock decided to close the school for a time rather than carry out the desegregation order. A 6-year-old's first day at school. This painting by Norman Rockwell shows what actually happened to Ruby Bridges on her first day at William Franz Elementary School in New Orleans on November the 14th, 1960. Keep in mind, this is 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education was issued. Ruby Bridges was the first African-American child to attend school after a federal court ordered the New Orleans school system to integrate. The public outcry was so great that white parents withdrew their children from school so they would not have to sit with a black girl. Ruby spent an entire year in a classroom by herself. What an unforgettable first day at school for a little 6-year-old. The Civil Rights Act of 1957. After events in Montgomery, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas, some liberal whites in Congress introduced the Civil Rights Act in 1957. It received no help from President Eisenhower, but the Civil Rights Act passed due to the efforts of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas, who went on to become vice president and then president. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 accomplished two things. First, it created a nationwide civil rights commission, and then it empowered, secondly, the Justice Department to go to court in cases where African Americans were denied the right to vote. This was not a huge step, but it was the first national piece of legislation since Reconstruction. President Kennedy and civil rights. Black protesters do not wait for presidential action. Momentum for civil rights continued to grow during the administration of President John F. Kennedy, although this was in spite of, not because of, Kennedy. The president was more concerned with maintaining the support of Southern Democrats, although three events eventually forced Kennedy to send a civil rights bill to Congress. The first event were the 1960s sit-ins. It began in Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 African-American college students sat at a segregated drugstore lunch counter, as you can see in the photograph on the left. The students were arrested, but as followers of Martin Luther King, their resistance was nonviolent. This event, this lunch counter sit-in, gave rise or spawned a series of similar protests across the South. The protesters from left to right were Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, William Smith, and Clarence Henderson, February the 2nd, 1960. And you can see in a segregated area of a lunch counter, you can enter the area if you are Black and a worker, but you cannot enter as a Black person and being a customer. A second event that forced President Kennedy to send a civil rights bill were the 1961 Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides. An interracial group of CORE members and college students from the North. Remember, CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality. An interracial group of CORE members and college students from the North traveled by bus down south to test the effectiveness of a 1960 Supreme Court decision that prohibited segregation in public areas for interstate travelers, like restrooms, waiting rooms, restaurants, in bus terminals, train stations, and the like. On Mother's Day, May 14th, 1961, a Greyhound bus carrying the Freedom Riders, in the photograph on the left, was attacked by a mob who slashed its tires and then firebombed the disabled vehicle outside of Anniston, Alabama. On the right, you can see some of the Freedom Riders being beaten by a mob of angry whites. According to the FBI, Bull Connor, who was the chief of police in Birmingham, the sheriff, Bull Connor, made a pact with the Ku Klux Klan that the police would stay away from the Birmingham bus terminal for 15 minutes after the Freedom Riders arrived, giving the Klan members enough time to severely beat James Peck and others on the right. This picture on the right was reclaimed by the government from a local journalist who was also beaten and whose camera was smashed. As a result of the violence, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the president, provided police escorts for the rioters, although this did not prevent, in all cases, further violence. A third series of events forced President Kennedy to send a civil rights bill finally to Congress. And these were the 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama. Chief of Police Bull Connor used fire hoses, billy clubs, and attack dogs on peaceful protesters, as you can see on the left, in the photograph at the left. And then 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in the photograph on the right, the organizing center for the Birmingham protests. The bombing occurred on September 15th, 1963, killing 4 young African-American girls who were inside the church at the time. All these events were pushing President Kennedy to take some action on civil rights, so he introduced the Civil Rights Bill in the summer of 1963. 2 of the 4 bombers were finally prosecuted and sentenced to life in prison in 2001, nearly 40 years after the bombing occurred. The 1963 March on Washington. The first March on Washington took place in 1963, and one of the organizers was the Venerable A. Philip Randolph, whose earlier planned march had disturbed Roosevelt. And of course, Randolph, as we have seen, called off the march. Throughout the years following World War II, a March on Washington group had met once a year to reiterate African-American demands for economic and social equality. Finally, in 1963, the time seemed right to carry out a March for Jobs and Freedom, designed specifically to support and promote the passage of the Civil Rights Bill that was stalled in Congress. You can see here a flyer, actually an organizing manual for those who wanted to participate in the March on Washington. And this, of course, shows the tremendous organizational skills of the March on Washington movement. A day like none other. The March for Jobs and Freedom finally took place on August 28th, 1963, and attracted over 200,000 Black and white Americans. The day's high point was the soaring address of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. But the Civil Rights Bill still languished in Congress. And it stayed there when it was still in committee when President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Only then was his successor, Lyndon Johnson, who had been instrumental in the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, only then was the president able to take up passage of a new civil rights bill and made it a major task. It was a formidable goal, but only one goal in Johnson's broad-reaching plan to build what he called a great society. But it would not have been possible without significant I'm almost at a loss for words. The extent of Black activism, Black organizing, Black assertiveness, Black autonomy on the part of so many men and women They made it possible. It wasn't that a Congress controlled by whites and controlled by political persons did this because it was the right thing to do. They did it because they were forced to do it. And that coercion that Dr. King talked about was pressed to a degree that may never have been equaled in the history of the United States up to that point. It was a Herculean effort on the part of millions of people who were unified, who did stick together. But freedom for Black Americans has never been a fully wrapped package. It's always one step at a time, sometimes 2 steps forward and a step backward. To conclude this lecture, fighting against fascism in Europe and fighting for equality in the United States. As World War II began, Black Americans, as we said at the beginning, found themselves fighting against fascism in Europe and for social justice and equality in the United States. In future lectures, we will take a look at even more social activism, even more efforts that Black Americans take to become free, which for them is always a process. I hope that was an informative, interesting lecture. I encourage you, if you have questions, to think about them and to reflect on what the lecturers have said. But I want to encourage you also to contact me and we will be happy to, I'll be happy to try to do what I can to make the material more clear. Thank you very much for your patience. I appreciate it.